Hello, my name is Russell Weiss. I'm a customs lawyer at Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Primarily, I work with importers and exporters and customs brokers regarding the issues that relate to the international trade in goods. And one of the issues that constantly comes up is the tariff classification of goods. And the reasons for that is that tariff classification determines so many important issues associated with the import or export of goods, whether it be the general duty rate, the availability of concessions, government controls over those goods. And on the flip side, it's also a relatively difficult issue. For many goods it may be simple, but the further goods are processed or manufactured, the more difficult tariff classification gets. So you have this, I guess, somewhat of a perfect storm of tariff classification being very important, but at the same time being reasonably difficult. So it's important that you understand the general nature of tariff classification and how it applies to your products, but it's also important to appreciate that it is difficult, and the information I'll give today is general advice, and if you have a very important material issue, you should of course seek advice from a legal advisor or a customs specialist. The most important element to remember is that tariff classification is entirely dependent on the characteristics of your individual goods. So even if a colleague tells you about someone else who had a particular tariff classification for goods that seems similar, it is always important to consider your particular goods, and things you may not think are relevant may actually have a big impact on the tariff classification. The topics I wanted to cover today is some general information about the tariff classification system so you can understand the structure of it and how it works. Then we'll go through why tariff classification is important. I'll then touch on the rules that apply to tariff classification, which are internationally accepted. I'll run through a quick case study just to show you how it works in reality, and I did mention that it is difficult, and we'll then talk about how to mitigate the risks. So the tariff classification system, it's often referred to as the harmonized system. It's an internationally accepted and standardized system of names and numbers that are allocated to goods, and it allows all traded products to be classified to a particular number. It's been around for a number of years now, nearly 30 years, and it's maintained by the World Customs Organization. Almost all of Australia's trading partners will adopt this international system, and they do so by way of various conventions and the like. The actual structure of the tariff is by way of chapters and sections, and within them subsections and the like. So there's 97 different chapters, and each chapter will touch on a different type of product, and those chapters are allocated to different sections, and there's 21 different sections. Just to give you a flavor, I have an example up on the screen. So the very first section deals with animals and animal products, and if you went into chapter 1 of that section, you would see a list of various types of live animals. Now, you're not going to get every animal that walks on Earth. You'll get the main ones, and then you'll have other, and anything that's not specifically dealt with will fit into that other category. And then if you move into chapter 2, you get meat type products, chapter 3 fish, chapter 4 dairy, and then it'll be products of animal origin not otherwise specified. And you could imagine products, whether it be eggs or the like, that may fall into that. But the way it gives a feel for how the tariff is structured. There'll always be a catch-all. It'll start specific, but then end up at the catch-all to make sure that all products are caught. And the tariff is updated, but it is only every 5 years. So it will be the case that products evolve that are not included in the tariff. So they definitely need that catch-all to be in there. The way goods are classified vary from chapter to chapter. What is the key element? So if we're just looking at food chapter, for instance, it does primarily just look at what is the product? Is it a potato? And if it's a potato, is it fresh? Is it frozen? Is it processed? So that's relatively easy. But then you look at other products, and it may bring into it what is the actual use of the product. So there's a classification for vehicles, but it will look at whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a non-passenger vehicle, or whether it's a passenger vehicle. Other type products, whether they're industrial type products, there'll be a different classification for an industrial heater as for a domestic heater, or for an industrial cooker versus a domestic stove. And then for other types of products, it's not what the product is, but what it's made out of. So a paper bag will have a different tariff classification to a plastic bag as opposed to a leather bag. So that it's quite a complicated system, but if you actually just play around and have a look in the different chapters, you start to get a bit of a feel for how it works. And there are resources that you can go to. So within Australia, we have our working tariff page, and that essentially just sets out all the various chapters, and you can click through and see the various goods. Now that's only good for products coming into Australia, but it will give you, I guess, a guide for everywhere else in the world, given the consistency of the tariff classification. But of course, you can look at websites for the countries to which you're exporting, and they will generally make available online their tariff. And some countries will also make available rulings or precedents regarding tariff classification. So you may be able to find a ruling that applies to a product that's very similar to yours, and that may give you a lot of confidence as to the correct tariff classification. So why is tariff classification important? I did allude to it at the beginning, and there's, I guess, a general reason for tariff classification, and that primarily goes to what is the duty rate. But it's also important to appreciate where it fits in the context of free trade agreements. So firstly, as I said, the tariff classification will determine the general duty rate, and that's important in the context of free trade agreements because the general rate may be zero, in which case you can then know that you don't need to use the FTA to get a lower rate. If the general rate is not zero, you should look at the schedule of the free trade agreement, which will be available on the DFAT website, and you'll be able to determine what may be the general rate that will apply, the specific preferential rate under the free trade agreement that will apply. It is also important because it determines any product-specific rules of origin under a free trade agreement. So we have general rules that apply to all products, so products that are of Australian origin because they are grown in Australia or they were produced in Australia, such as metals or animals or food, they will be of Australian origin. But where goods have inputs from both Australia and outside Australia, there are product-specific rules of origin that determine whether that product is an Australian product, and you need to get the tariff classification to determine that product-specific rule. One of those product-specific rules looks at whether there's been a change in tariff classification of the imported good versus the what's been exported. And if we consider a basic example, such as a sheet of glass that's imported, the rule may look at what changes in that tariff classification compared to the exported good. If the exported good is a motor vehicle, there's quite a change in the tariff classification of a sheet of glass to a motor vehicle, but ultimately you need to understand how tariff classification works to make those decisions. Tariff classification also determines the application of other concessions, and those other concessions may be more beneficial than the free trade agreement, so you may also wish to investigate those. But there are more general reasons as well. Sometimes the rate of VAT or GST will be determined by the tariff classification. In almost all cases, any excise or anti-dumping duties, which can be extremely high, will be determined by the tariff classification. Governments control many imports and exports, and sometimes those controls are based on the tariff classification of goods. Some goods may need a license depending on the tariff classification. Of course, governments like to keep trade statistics, and tariff classification and information included in import declarations is a key way of tracking which goods are being traded. And lastly, a tariff classification may determine how risky the good is treated by a customs authority, so the level of intervention you'll have in the import or export of that good. It's important to appreciate that the incorrect classification can have both a financial effect in that you may be over or underpaying duty, but also an operational effect in that foreign governments, if they don't trust your classification, they will then have to inspect the goods. So in more detail, the risks of incorrect classification, that operational impact, delays in the clearance of goods, that's what's really going to really slow down your business and cause grief for your foreign customers. Over and underpayment of duty, that makes sense. And you should appreciate though, some tariff classifications, or many, will have the same duty rate, so you may not actually notice a difference in the duty rate by getting the tariff classification wrong, but you still will be making a false statement to customs. You'll be saying the goods are classified to one heading when in fact they're classified to another. So it is important to get that right, because some countries impose quite strict penalties even if there isn't a financial outcome. Often these decisions will be made by a customs broker, and the customs broker will be the entity lodging the import declaration with the foreign government. However, they will be acting as your agent if you're the importer, and you will ultimately be liable for the information that's included. Now, there are a number of rules that are universally adopted relating to tariff classification. But before you get to those rules, it's important that you correctly identify the goods. That's the first step of tariff classification, is to have agreement or certainty on what is the good I'm actually classifying here. So if you think of something that may seem like quite a simple example, a women's cotton top. If you identify that as a woolen top, it will lead to the incorrect classification because there's different subheadings for cotton as opposed to woolen tops. If you identify it as a male top, that will lead to the incorrect classification, as women's and men's clothing are classified under different headings. And you may think, well, surely they'll tax women's and men's clothing the same, but under some FTAs the rates are different. For instance, men's suits, and maybe this is because there may be a greater volume of men's suits, are taxed more heavily than women's suits. If you identify the same top as a jacket, that will also lead to an incorrect classification. So you can see with a simple product how important it is to correctly identify the goods. And it's also important to appreciate that if your customs broker may be making this decision, they will need good information from you as to the classification of the good, or information about the characteristics of the goods, so that they can correctly classify it. They won't be handling all of your goods and they won't be inspecting them themselves. They will rely on the information you provide. So the general rules that apply, no matter where you are in the world, firstly is that classification is determined by the terms of the relevant headings in the tariff, not the chapter headings or the section headings. They're there for guidance. There are notes that apply, section and chapter notes, which are relevant. Headings will cover goods in an incomplete, unfinished form, unassembled form, or mixtures of those goods with other goods. So it anticipates that goods will be traded at various forms of completion. Of course, it may well be that something is at such an incomplete form that it can't be identified as the complete article, but rather it's seen as something that is at an earlier stage of manufacture. For instance, a plastic bowl is quite different to the base plastic product that will be eventually molded into that bowl. You wouldn't treat that base plastic as an incomplete bowl. So it just depends on the particular good and whether the incomplete version is more properly referable to the complete version or to the base input into that manufactured good. There will be instances where two or more headings could potentially apply, and that's because of that allowance that mixtures of goods shall be dealt with under the one heading. Where that is the case, you need to look at the more specific heading. So even where you haven't got a mixture of goods, there still will be multiple headings that can apply. Think of a refrigerator that's made out of steel. There's a heading that applies for steel products. There's also a heading that applies for refrigerators. The rules say the more specific heading should apply so you classify the good as a refrigerator. Composite goods should be determined by the good that gives it its essential character. A simple composite good may be thinking about a TV with a DVD player built into it. It's both a DVD player and a TV. You need to think about which good gives it its essential character. Some people may well argue in that instance that the TV is used on all occasions, but the DVD player is only used when you want to watch a DVD, and therefore it's the TV which gives the good its essential character. Where you can't determine the heading according to those rules I previously discussed, there has to be some sort of tiebreaker because goods do need to be classified. So ultimately they say whichever classification falls last in numeric order. So if we think of a piece of furniture that has built into it some sort of electronic device, the chapters that apply to electronic devices are in the 70s and 80s, and the chapters that apply to furniture is in the 90s, so the good will be classified as furniture. Goods always come as packing material, and whether that's paper or plastic or the like, it would have a different classification from the product it's holding if the rules didn't deal with it. But the rules say that those packing materials and cases should be classified according to the goods they're presented with. And lastly, there's a rule that subheadings should be dealt with in the same way as the headings in accordance with the rules I've just discussed. The courts have also given us guidance as to classification. They say that classification is determined by an objective test. So don't worry about what the importer intends to do with the goods or what the exporter designed the goods for. Have a look at the goods as they stand on their own and determine identify them and classify them in that manner. It is also commonly said it's a wharfside test, so it's a test that should be able to be applied if there was a customs broker down on the docks looking at the goods as they came off the ship. So that, I guess, indicates that it should be a relatively simple test and not one that involves precise or detailed tests and rules regarding the classification or intensive investigations as to what the good is. However, regard does have to be had to the characteristics of the goods as they would be present to an informed observer. So although the good may look like one thing, you do have to have a look at the actual characteristics, and the person classifying them should be taken to be aware of those unique characteristics. And it's how the good exists at the time of import. So it doesn't matter what happened before import or after import, the decision is made at the time of import. Now you can't get around classification of the goods just by naming it or describing it or packing it in a certain way. They won't pay much attention to those sorts of labels. They'll look at the good itself. And I mentioned that essential character test before. For a particular essential character to be taken to give the product its classification, that essential character must have the dominating influence upon the essence of the product. And I'll run through an example which will give us an idea of how that applies. So there was a Ministry of Appeals Tribunal case that dealt with ceiling fans that contained a light, and there's a particular tariff heading that applies for fans, there's a particular tariff heading that applies for lights, but there's not a tariff heading that applies to fans with lights. So the tribunal had to first consider, does the essential character test apply here? Does either the fan or the light give this composite product its essential character? Now, people I speak to generally say, well, it's a fan with a light, so let's classify it as a fan. But the tribunal went through various factors and found that no, neither the fan nor the light does give its essential character. It can operate as a light without the fan, and it can operate as a fan without the light. And they looked at various things such as the size, the design, various sort of buying habits relating to the goods, and they weren't satisfied that either element gave it its essential character. So then they had to go to that tiebreaker test, and ultimately the good was classified as a light because the light classification heading fell later in numerical order to the fan classification heading. It's also just relevant to note as well that the classification is hard, and both in the US and New Zealand rulings have been released that a ceiling fan with a light should be classified as a fan. So you will see some inconsistency just because it is a difficult issue. There are ways to manage risk, and it'll just depend on your particular product. There'll be some products where there can just be no doubt as to what the classification is, and the more basic a product is, or the more specific a rule that applies, the more certainty that you will get regarding that product. If there is uncertainty, you can obtain rulings from the relevant customs authority. Australian Customs will provide a ruling, so too will almost all other customs authorities that you're dealing with. Once you get that ruling, you can generally rely on it provided the facts don't change. Some cases a ruling won't be necessary, but you still need advice from a broker or a customs specialist. You'll generally already be using a customs broker, so speak to that broker. Feel free to challenge them and ask them to explain to you why they believe a particular classification should be adopted. But it is one way to sort of get a bit more certainty. And lastly, there are publicly available rulings and precedents that you can look at. They won't bind a customs authority as per your goods, but you can get some guidance from them. So it is a very important issue. A lot flows from the classification of the goods. It's crucial to have an understanding of the classification to properly utilise a free trade agreement. If you have any doubts about the classification or want some further information, you can feel free to contact us. Details are on the screen now, or feel free to also use your customs broker who should be able to help with most classification issues. I thank you for your time today.